Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no coping. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Hey everyone, the Zach Bitter episode is brought to you by Simply Snackin'. Zach, I didn't get to ask him, but he might have little pockets in his dolphin shorts. I think that's what they run in. I'm not sure. That's what they used to be back in my day. But this is a snack he could have carried with him. And Zach, if you're Zach, you can eat the higher carb version, I'm pretty sure, if you're running 100 miles at a time or 12 hours without stopping, training for a 24-hour run, or if you're running across the country like he's planning on doing. I think if you're doing those kind of activities, I think the higher carb, 4 carbs, I think is going to be okay, even if he has one every 5 minutes. But for the rest of us, I would recommend the lower carb options, chicken or beef, grass-fed, great stuff, no artificial stuff, really good. So thank you for listening. And again, thank you for sponsoring us here to bring Zach to the world. He's one of my favorite guys, really awesome, zen, cool, amazing mindset. So you're going to enjoy this episode. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. Now, this is the one that got away, that circled back around again. This guy, I'm telling you, he has the worst sport. I was thinking about it this morning. I was thinking, like, if I had to rank all the sports I would personally do, it would be right after being the guy who holds the balloon in his mouth when they throw the knives at you. This is like, seriously, like in high school, I was thinking about it. I said, in high school, when I played football and I wrestled, like if we got in trouble and did the wrong thing, we'd have to do your sport, right? They go, okay, you guys shut up or you're going to have to run. And we like, be quiet, guys. Don't listen to the coach. Zach Bitter, let me tell guys, anyone who doesn't know about running, which is not, it's not my sport. I've already made that clear. He's an ultramarathon runner. He ran 100 miles with a pace of 6 minutes and 48 seconds, right? Then they go, hey, if you keep running, you could do the 12-hour race. He like blows away all the records, and it's insane. Then, as if that's not bad enough, he runs 100 miles on the treadmill, trail running, track running. It's insane, man. I mean, how do you do it, Zach? Plus, he was a high school teacher, like. And he's co-host of a podcast, HPO with Sean Baker. So if you want to talk about someone who's mentally tough, Zach Bitter, man, welcome. So awesome to have you back again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Brian. And I'm sorry we lost that previous recording, but it's good to get back on and chat with you a bit. But to help fill in some of your questions there, one of the ways to get excited about running is to be able to beat the football team in the 1 mile, but when you join the football team, be third string for the opportunity to get your head knocked off a couple times a day in practice.
Yeah, you're the smartest one because, the injuries. It's funny that you say that because I played football, I wrestled, I played a lot of sports, basketball. The most injuries I ever have is jogging. Like I'll pull a hamstring, pull an Achilles on it because I'm not built like you, man. I mean, you're a machine.
Yeah, but it is goofy because when I think of sports in general, like some of the traditional ones that a lot of kids get exposure to in their school years is like, soccer, football, baseball, basketball. And it seems like a lot of those sports, they have a fairly good structure, at least nowadays, where like they kind of like, they give you a lot of skill set development to get ready for the actual act of doing it. Whereas with like running, they kind of just throw you out there to a degree and say, oh, well, everyone kind of knows how to run, therefore just go out there and do that. And then you're good. So like, obviously there's methodology behind different workouts and things like that, but the actual like mechanic of running properly and that sort of stuff, I think sometimes it gets lost a lot of times when people first get into the sport. And then you're kind of left to like, if you just naturally have a really good mechanic that works well with your body and the way it kind of like spreads out the impact forces, which I'm probably one of. I've had very few injuries in my career, but like it's an interesting concept, like the education behind the sport and all that stuff too.
Yeah, and just the endurance, man, the mental part of it. That's what intrigues me about you the most. Like, how do you, I think I go bike riding with a buddy of mine, and we ride like 30 or 40 miles, and we're done. And I see these guys running, and every time I ride past them, I think, man, why don't they just ride their bike? That looks like they're not having fun to me. They look like they're struggling, right? Then I see you run 100 miles like nothing. It's like it's absolute insanity.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing, I think, because like when I look at my running just from when I first did it to like when I ran in college to when I started training on my own and kind of just being able to pick exactly what race I wanted to prepare for. And then even today, just like the motivations and just the general kind of relationship with the sport kind of evolves and changes and things like that. So I think really like the key to sticking to it is just kind of relearning reasons why you enjoy it, or like keeping, I guess, an open mind as to like why you're doing it, or letting your why evolve and not getting too hung up on like maybe what was motivating me when I was in high school, or what was motivating me when I was in college or post college and today, and that sort of thing. And for me, I've just always been able to kind of find that pretty easily, I think. So that's probably kept me excited to be in the sport and continue to do it and not switch to something else, because you know I do a lot of crazy races, and I think sometimes people ask, why do you do that? What's so exciting about that? Or I would never want to do that. And I'll do coaching calls sometimes with folks who want to do like an ultra marathon or a running race, and we get into the whys of it, and it turns out they don't actually want to do a running race. They just want to get in shape, and then we try to find a way that's going to be fun and motivating for them to do that, versus just, hey, let's do a 50-mile or 100-mile race just for the sake of doing that. So it is, I think there is a lot of interesting kind of psychology behind all of it.
Yeah, how has your motivation changed over the years? Like, what motivates you now to say, okay, I'm putting the shoes on and going for a run,
Mm-hmm.
compared to when you
Yeah,
were in high school or younger
sure.
years?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, I mean, my early motivator was, I think, what we kind of maybe highlighted a little bit in the very beginning here, was like, it was something I was better at. Like my options were have a shot at making the state track and cross country meet, or, basically be like, an average at best participant in some of the other sports. Not that I don't know that I would have been able to work my way up in some of those had I given them as much time and energy as I have running, but when you're younger like that, you tend to gravitate towards what you're best at, I think, and that kind of shapes a little bit of your motivation at that point in time. And fortunately for me, by the time I kind of got to the point where I was going to college, I started to kind of realize, I'm not going to be an Olympic 5K runner. I'm not going to have a career racing like track and field circuits and things like that. I found like my next motivation for it, which was just kind of understanding the different like training techniques and what certain workouts kind of do, and what kind of positive impacts will they have on like a performance. So it kind of shifted to just like kind of a personal challenge, something I could kind of take with me no matter where I went. I was in an interesting point in my life where, I was a college student, then ultimately a new teacher. So I was open and willing to move around a lot, and running was a sport that I could easily kind of plug and play anywhere. So whether I was training for like say a marathon or a 50-mile race in Wisconsin, the goal was still kind of the same as if I were doing that in California or now Arizona. So I think that kind of was like a helpful bridge for me personally. And then one thing I kind of learned through that experience of just kind of understanding the different training techniques and styles and all that stuff was that if I just had to pick a run that I enjoyed the most, it was the long run, which is where I guess I get a little crazy to some people. And that kind of drew me, I think, to ultra marathon running. And ultra marathon running was kind of a new experience for me, in the sense that I was able to be competitive beyond the level that I had been at some of the shorter distances earlier in my career. Like even the success I had as like a middle school, high school runner, once I got to like the state and certainly the national level, it was like I was pretty mediocre amongst the top guys in the sport. So ultra marathoning kind of positioned me in a spot where I could compete with the best in the sport in a lot of cases, especially when I was able to train specifically for the environment in which I was going to race. And that kind of almost married those two passions, where I had this drive to try to like compete, this drive to chase after records, which is, when you're 80 miles into a 100-mile race, there is an advantage to looking down at the clock and saying, hey, I'm on pace for a world record, versus I'm just trying to finish this thing. So that's certainly helpful, but then also just kind of knowing where I came from more or less. So I still had that desire, that motivation to really just compete with myself. And ultimately, I think where it comes down is I really love like looking at like an event that I want to prepare for as kind of an end goal, and then building a plan kind of backwards and just recognizing the steps along the way that I want to kind of accomplish in order to get ready for it. And then watching kind of how like your mind, your body, your workout results change throughout that process. I really love that. So that even if I were like a middle or the back of the packer, I think that desire would still keep me motivated to do the sport to some degree. Yeah, I think that sort of sums up kind of what drives me at the, it drives me at the moment.
Yeah, and the fact that you keep going, because people don't realize that the hours and hours of training. I mean, it's grueling, just training for that moment in the spotlight. You know, they don't realize you don't just put on your shoes one day and go out and run. You know, there's so much preparation, mental, physical, injuries, you know, pain, all that stuff you go through to do your sport.
Yeah, you get kind of educated, sometimes trial by fire, I think, in ultra marathoning, because unlike the Olympic distance sports where there's a pretty big dearth of just research and information about kind of the best way to go about it, or a way to go about it that has been proven to be successful time and time again for quite a few people. So even if you don't fit into that box, then there's still a lot of other information you can kind of lean on to and turn it into a bit of an individual experience. But with ultra running, it's still so wide open in the sense that like we just don't have good research to say what is happening to someone at hour 18 of a race that's going to take you 24 hours to finish. And like the intensities are very low, so it opens up this huge window of like fueling potential relative to maybe some other sports that are in what I would call like a gray area intensity. And it's just that sort of like approach to things, I think, makes it a little more interesting in the sense that like, you know, you have to kind of find what works for you, and what works for you may be exactly the opposite of what works for the person next to you. So I find that part of the sport really interesting too, where we're kind of pioneering it still to a degree. There's a lot of anecdotes out there that people lean on, as opposed to like real direct studies that would show like this is why this is happening and this isn't, kind of a mindset.
Yeah, and the thing I really liked about you is when you were on low carb, when we had our low carb MD discussion, you were like, hey, when we asked you what your diet was like, because everyone talks about you being low carb, keto, high fat, and all that, and you go, it depends on the day, right? You cycle your diet because people want to put you in. You know, obviously Sean has some followers that go, okay, if you're not strict carnivore, then but you go, look, I'm an N of one, and I do what works for me, and you know how your body works, right? And so I see people that can change their diet with time once they get metabolically healthier, once their training ends or whatever. And I think that's so critical that you're not just pigeonholed into one thing.
Yeah, it gets interesting. And I think like when I was co-hosting HPO with Sean, one of the things that did sometimes confuse our listeners, especially the ones who would come in for an interview here or there, was you have someone like Sean who he's very high intensity. Like his workouts are just explosive. Like there's a very low amount of volume that you can actually do the stuff Sean's doing at in a day before you just run yourself, dry. So like he can put in maybe like an hour of really hard work per day, and with a fairly consistent like ebb and flow like that day in and day out. He can kind of structure his nutrition, I think, in a way where he eats basically the same thing every day because he knows what he's going to need every day. Whereas you get into the opposite end of the spectrum where you're like long haul endurance stuff like I'm doing, there's like a big range of what my lifestyle may look like from one day to the next. So the most polarizing example of this would be around a race. So like I might go out on a Saturday and run 100 miles for an entire day, and then the next 3 days I might hardly move. So like the energy demands and just like the way your body behaves to fuel and things like that are quite different from my experience when you're looking at those two extremes. And, there's a lot of consistency within that too. Those are definitely the two polar ends. There's times a year where like my schedule is a lot more predictable, but the easiest way to maybe describe is I probably go through about 4 or 5 different kind of like cycles during the year of different types of intensities, different types of volume, things that range from off season to peak training, which can be like no running at all to running 150 plus miles in a week. So I kind of need to be open-minded about like how I'm treating food during those different time frames. Just like if I had 5 completely different people and I was trying to find the best diet for each one of them, chances are there's going to be some nuances within each one of those 5 people. I kind of have to treat myself like that. Basically what I'm saying, Brian, is I'm schizophrenic.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. You figure out what works for you. And I think that's so important because a lot of us get pigeonholed into one thing and they go, you're just a low carb keto guy. Well, not necessarily. Some guys can get away with more carbs. So look at even Sean, you look at Sean, if he wanted to eat fruit, I mean, he'd be fine like with his muscle mass and his no visceral fat and all that kind of stuff. So, seeing you two together on the podcast was actually funny because I kind of knew Sean just through the low carb and keto world. And I'm like, this guy's like his partner here, this Zach guy. I don't know what he does, but he's pretty mellow and chill and like cool headed, and it's funny. But then I had the honor of interviewing Sean, and man, like I told you before we recorded, it was stunning. Like his life experience and stories, I was like, wow, there's so much more substance, and I see the connection between you guys. There's that mental toughness that you both have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sean's an interesting guy. I think every once in a while, I mean, this didn't happen too often. Every once in a while, someone would look at kind of maybe my presence on social media and then Sean's presence on social media. And they're like, how did you two guys end up co-hosting a podcast together? And I would just say like, well, I mean, listen to a few of our podcast interviews. I think you'll probably get a better appreciation of Sean as a person versus Sean as an Instagram account. So like, yeah, I mean, when people ask like why, what drew you two together for podcasting, things like that, it's like, well, think about it. I mean, Sean is someone who represents a person who has been a professional rugby player. He's competed in the Highland Games. He's got a world-class power lifter. He's, a straight, he's done it. When I looked at kind of just his experience with different, like what I would consider kind of cool niche type of like activities, competitive rowing type of stuff, like he seemed to be like multiple different like chapters to like a highly competitive athlete or like multiple different competitive athletes, because it would seem like he would almost like master one and then say what's close enough to this that I have the skill set to really perfect, but is going to excite me to get after it. And then he would do it. And there was probably like 5 or 6 of those different things between like the rugby, the rowing, and Highland Games stuff. He served in the military. He was an orthopedic surgeon. There's like so much there that it's just like for someone like myself, who's just really curious as to like what motivates people, what excites people, and what drives people and things like that. Sean is hard to beat in terms of like a type of a person that you can really get interested about like the hows and whys with that sort of stuff. So it was a lot of fun to kind of do podcasts with him for a while with all that stuff.
Yeah, and he's so busy with everything too. And it's funny because Tro, my partner on the podcast, is a New Yorker, gets in people's face, brilliant guy, great guy. So like on Twitter, people go, well, why are you associated with this guy? But you look at him and his substance, his brilliance, and all that stuff, it way outweighs it. So you're right. Sometimes that forum is kind of tough. I'm more, I don't want to get in conflict with people. I don't have time for that. And, I'm probably not going to convince you to my point of view. But, I've always seen you as that voice of reason, a guy who is humble and kind and decent. I see what you value. And, I'm drawn to that. I think a lot of people are drawn to that. The Jerry Springers of the world are going to attract a certain amount of people, probably a lot more people, because it's more exciting and more, nail biting excitement. But sometimes just seeing the truth as you see it, even if you're wrong, expressing it in a decent way and say, okay, we agree to disagree.
Yeah, I think it's just like some of it's just personality too, because like I totally get on social media, like if you can add a little wow factor to your post, you're probably going to get a few more followers. And if you have a message you think is really valuable, you're going to have more people listening to that message ultimately when you get around to saying it. So like some of the ways that folks go about it, I don't necessarily see that as like a flaw in them, I guess, as much as it is, or even a variance in what I do or what you maybe do, Brian, but more or less just like, well, this is the way they structured these things. So like you play the game or you don't kind of a mindset. But I think at the end of the day, like you get just a lot of different personalities too. Like some people are just like a lot more eccentric in like their ability to kind of like, play around on social media versus myself, who's probably a little more introverted with it, where I don't mind sharing stuff at all. But I'm probably not going to be super controversial on it either. So not all the
Yeah.
time anyway.
So Zach, did you ever hit a point when you started having success and you're breaking these records? Did you ever get complacent, or did you ever get like, hey, I'm all that? Did you ever think you arrived? Did you ever think like, you kind of lost that fire in your gut?
I've had different, like I've ebbed and flowed in my career as to like where my confidence has been, I think. And I've definitely asked myself, like, am I doing this right? Is this the right way? And questioned my approach from time to time, but I've been able to kind of trust it long enough and or I've been able to trust it enough to never waver, but be open-minded enough to like make adjustments when something's clearly not working. So, um, I've never really gotten to the point where I really felt like, okay, I'm the best and no one can beat me. And that's kind of like, what's going to drive me to keep going. I've always felt more probably further from that, in that like I'm eking out every last bit of my potential here. And, there's still guys who could beat me on certain courses and things like that. So like, I've got a lot of respect for the other competitors in the sport. But for me, I think where it's been an interesting kind of just ebb and flow through the years is, I had a lot of success early at runnable 100 milers. The first track ultra I did was this timed event in Phoenix, Arizona called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational in 2013. It was the second 100 mile I had completed, first track event I had done, first timed event I did. I actually broke the 12-hour world record that day, which is how far you can run in 12 hours. Didn't even know that was a record until mile 89 and a half. So like I had a little bit of success, I think, early enough where once I kind of had that success, the next step was like, okay, now if I did that, I need to be able to do this next. And it didn't happen as quickly as I thought it would, given kind of how naturally I kind of was able to run smoothly on that kind of controlled surface type of an event. So 2013 was when that event first happened. I went on to re-break my American record for 100 miles in 2015. But it wasn't until end of 2019 that I broke the world record for 100 miles and re-broke my 12-hour world record from 2013, which is something I thought I was probably going to do in like 2014, 2015 after that first race. So for me, it was just kind of figuring out, okay, this is where I started at. Here's where I've made improvements, but what else do I need to kind of change and adapt to in order to really get myself to that point where I feel like, all right, that may have been one of my best races. And if I run faster than this, it's going to be because like, a couple things happened that were somewhat out of my control that allowed me to get a few more minutes here and a few more minutes there, and stuff where it's not as like, as much like there was a big glaring mistake I made here that I need to fix. And if I fix this, I'm going to chop another 30 minutes off my time or something like that. So I think for me, it's just been like trusting the things that I know I'm doing right, because I've had countless examples of that proving itself in training and results, but also being open and minded enough to adapt things that I wasn't doing right in order to get myself in a position to make some of those improvements. And I think like that's the exciting part of the sport for me, is that kind of strategy side of things. And, nutrition was a big one for me. That one was a little earlier in my career. And then it was more just fine tuning it based on just like we talked about before, I definitely fit in the low carb category year round, regardless of my higher carb days, quote unquote. Still pretty much, at most 20 to maybe a couple times a year, 30% of my diet coming from carbohydrate. So when you look at most endurance athletes, where for them going low carb would maybe be 50% of their diet, it definitely stands out, I think, in a lot of cases. But you're talking to folks who are strict ketogenic, or someone who's like with Sean's zero carb type stuff, then it seems like there's an awful lot of carbohydrates there. So that's like one aspect that I've been very, I guess, open-minded around. And then it's just kind of like almost separating yourself from what you really want to do from time to time to give yourself a mental and physical break from that. So I got very interested in running fast 100 miles, very controllable, short loop, like almost as fast of an environment as you can find type 100-mile races. And that ate up a huge portion of my training, my mental capacity, my dedication for years and years. And really, it wasn't until I put myself in a position where I gave myself kind of planned breaks from that type of training and that type of mentality that I really recognized how excited I can get about training for that when I kind of hit the reset button. So for me, it wasn't stepping away from the sport for a period of time. It was just leveraging some of the other opportunities within it. So ultra marathoning has such a variety of stuff, from 50Ks up above 10,000 feet sea level to 6-day events around a 400-meter track and stuff like that. So for me, it was like, oh, I'm going to do a 100-miler that's out in the mountains instead of one that's on a track for half a year, and just see kind of how that resets my mind. And that really helped me, I think, was just making some of those adjustments, and rather than just bang my head against the wall on things that I had been doing over and over again, being willing to make some changes when I think they're going to actually move me forward a little bit down the road. So patience, I think, is the big takeaway there.
Yeah, I think that's true in life. I mean, sometimes we just bang our heads and we keep forcing an issue and not saying, okay, let me take a break, let me reassess, let me think about things. I know in my life when I made changes, that's when I really grew, and not just doing the same thing over and over, training the same way. You go, okay, let me make some changes. This isn't working. Let's change a variable, and trying to figure out what works for you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I mean, endurance sport, in all sports, I think, show this from time to time. There's the folks that you remember that are like, wow, that person just was always there. They seem to always find a way to stay in it, to stay excited about it. They never seem to be like, in a point where they were so frustrated they wanted to quit. And then, there's folks that come into the sport and they come in with a bang, and you're like, wow, this person's the next Michael Jordan of ultra marathoning. And then 3 years later, they're nowhere to be found. And you wonder what happens. And I think sometimes it is like, you just like finding something that worked in the beginning and not being able to recognize that just because it worked when you first started, that's stimulus may not continue to bear results, especially if it's unsustainable. And you might have to adapt and kind of work with what your body's giving you, and be open-minded to some other alternatives if what like has worked for the majority, or you think has worked for the majority, isn't working for you personally. So again, something I find a little bit extra exciting about ultra marathon running, since it is a little more open-ended.
Yeah, you told Trode and myself about your San Diego experience, because I was asking about, if you see someone take off and they're way ahead of you, what does that do to you mentally? And tell people about that, because I think that's an important mindset.
Yeah, I learned a lot from that race in particular, because I think, like, if I look at my race results historically, I do tend to do better when I'm kind of in it and up there in the front early. And I've gotten some of my better results, I think, when I'm in that position. But 2019 was interesting, where I had a couple races where I just did what I knew I could tolerate early on, and just let what everyone else was going to do happen. And then if they knocked it out of the park and beat me, so be it. If not, then I'm still going to have my best race on the day. And if that means I'm first, second, or third, or wherever, then that is what it is, kind of a mindset. And I think that what that ended up doing is it just removed a lot of the mental noise and anxiety that can just kind of burn you out if you're hyper fixated on that sort of stuff too early on. So I think the 100-miler racers that are the most consistent are very good at that. They can let someone take off the front and do their thing, and that doesn't stress them out. I think where it becomes a problem is if you sit there and then you're thinking from, say, mile 10 to mile 40 about how this person has 30 minutes on you, 28 minutes on you, 33 minutes on you, and just having that kind of like consume your mental capacity, versus just focusing on what you need and what you need to do to keep moving forward at the fastest pace you can sustain. And that's kind of how San Diego played out for me. I think I executed one of the more tactical races I've done, where I think the furthest behind I was maybe at the most 30 minutes. I think it was probably inside of that, but it was right around there. And I just kind of started chipping away at that around the 60-ish mile time frame. And then by mile 93, I had taken the lead. I think it was the last aid station on the course. And it's just a really interesting way to kind of win a race where you're chasing for 93 miles and then you take the lead with single digit miles left and, cross that line first. And that taught me a lot about just the patience required for 100-mile racing. Also just like where you need your head to be in that last, like say third to quarter of the race, because I also thought that barring maybe one or two different experiences, had felt like 100-mile races to me had always been like a survival fest for the last 20 miles, even on some of my really good performances. Like it always felt like I was giving something back in that last 20, where San Diego, I felt like I ran my strongest the last like 25 miles. And then at the Pettit Center, where I broke the 100-mile world record, I unequivocally ran better the last 20 miles. The data produces that I was running faster the last 20.
Your second 50 was faster than your first 50, and that's insane. That's incredible. That is unbelievable, man. That shows mental toughness, right? That is just training and mental toughness and pushing yourself, and then continue for 12 hours, like another 41 minutes or something. To me, that is just like, because I can imagine. For me, I was thinking this morning, I was listening to your interview with Sean, and like that you run 4 hours one direction, then you run 4 hours the other direction. I'm like, at 8 hours, you're at zero. Like exactly what you just wound the clock and unwound the clock. I was thinking mentally, it's like digging a ditch and filling the ditch and digging the ditch. I'm like, man, it's just like, see, that's my mindset. And it's funny because guys like you, I was thinking about it because I have friends who are Navy SEALs, and they always talk about, oh, that poor guy rang the bell, like he got out. It's like that guy was probably thinking, forget this, man. It's not worth it. I'll do something different, right? And that's like for you, I can see how guys burn out in your sport because they're like, look, I'm training, I have no life, and marital stuff. And also the other thing I wanted to say, what you just posted a picture of you and your wife finishing a race together. And I was like, that is awesome stuff, man.
Yeah, I've definitely got a unique situation where like I've got a good example at home that I can look to whenever I'm feeling like I'm not motivated to get out there and training, because my wife, Nicole, is a very competitive ultramarathoner in her own right. She tends to focus more on the trail mountain type of stuff as what excites her. But I mean, she's got a harder day job than I do by all accounts. So watching her kind of navigate that, as well as get the training in and ultimately show up to a race, in a position where she feels like she can compete is a huge piece of the puzzle for my own inspiration, and probably a big reason why I broke that world record at 100 miles when I did, because it was, a couple of years after meeting her. So, yeah, that's it is very helpful having that. And I think like to also add to the kind of the question you asked too, is just, I think what happens to a lot of people is they maybe don't get far enough into the sport to get to a point where they have enough experiences, both positive, negative, and everywhere in between, to really build up a toolkit that's going to like get them through some of the really, really awkward spots in a race to the point where they feel like they can really execute one. Where when I look back at some of my races that are in the last year or two that have went really well, there's a couple points in each one of those where I had to reflect back on a previous event or a previous workout that helped me kind of navigate that space mentally, that had I not had that experience, I just wouldn't have had that tool available to me. And who knows if I would have dropped out, if I would have slowed down and ran a much slower time and all this other stuff. So like some of it is just like, I think being patient enough and looking for the positives in even a bad race, or the takeaways that you can learn from, and even the bad races, to the point where you have a lot of options to kind of pull from when you get into a hard place in a race that is otherwise a really good race.
Has self-doubt ever been an issue for you? Like in the middle of a race, you go, I just don't have it today. I'm not fueled right. Has that ever?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically every race at some point, it really just comes down to kind of like how it impacts you. And I've given this actually a lot of thought, because like you have a race where you push through maybe one or two or three like situations like that more than you normally would be able to. And it almost makes you like, if you go too negative with it, you can think like, gosh, how many good races I leave on the table because I mentally checked out before I was actually ready to. But I mean, some of that I think is part of the process too. You have to kind of like inch forward versus leap forward in a lot of cases. So But yeah, I mean, even when I broke the world records for 100 miles in 12 hours, I think it was somewhere around mile 40. I had just kind of ran the math on my pacing and stuff, and had some numbers in my head that I wasn't exactly thrilled about at the moment. I was just like, I don't know, maybe this isn't my day. Maybe I should just kind of settle in here and run a solid race, but save like the real hard miles for a race down the road. And thankfully, before actually taking that approach, I looked at the splits, which we have very frequently on a course like that. It was like a 400, and I think, if I remember right, 38-meter loop. Inside a controlled environment. I was just like, well, I'm only a couple seconds per lap off my goal pace. Let's just get back into that for a couple miles and see what happens. And then let's not make any big, race altering decisions here at 40 miles into 100. And, for me, like once I did that, I took that kind of more positive approach. Things started kind of clipping away to the point where I was running some splits faster than I really felt comfortable doing. And I had to kind of pull myself back in. And it just kind of shows you how like it's this weird situation in these long races where you can be in a position where you're like, I don't feel great, and think it can only progressively get worse than this. How could I continue running and somehow start feeling better when the activity that's making me feel this way right now is running? But it happens. Like you can feel really bad at say mile 40, and then at mile 60 feel better than you ever have. And it's just this weird mind trip, I think, that like is really hard to wrap your head around at the time. So, but the more of those experiences you are able to get through training and racing, the better you're able to use that as an example when you get to that point in a race, to not kind of give in right away and give yourself a few extra opportunities to kind of rally. So I mean, that was an example of a really good performance too. So like when you think of, different races where like, I've had low points and it's just like, yeah, this is not my day. And you just actually like succumb to it and run really slow in or drop out. I've got those examples as well. But I like to look at them as learning opportunities as much as anything.
Yeah, then you come back the next time, right? My youngest, she was a competitive swimmer, and like one of the girls on her team was Olympic trial cuts and all that. So I was joking, and I say, "Hey, do you think you'll ever beat her?" And she was young at the time. She goes, "Yeah, someday."
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I was like, I laughed because I was like, that's like in her mind, she believed that, right?
Yeah.
Then she ends up getting injured and changes her sport to soccer and all that stuff. I was like, man, in that mindset, a lot of people just don't have that mindset. You go, of course not. I'll never beat her. She's great. So like to have that, and I think you're one of those people who has that mindset. And how in life, when you go through hard times, what do you lean on?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think like, there's the kind of like I said before, when I broke the American record for 100 miles in 2015, but had been on pace for the world record through 80 miles, there was this point where it was a clear break in, I was running very well for 80 miles, and then the wheels started getting really wobbly the last 20. So for me, it was like, that was always a point to kind of like focus on, where like I need to get myself back in that position where I can kind of right that situation. So I think that fed into a lot of like how I raced the 100 miles at the Pettit Center. But I think situations like that, especially when you can get to a point where you were patient enough to kind of get through some spots that were more difficult or some lows and have that accomplishment, then you put yourself in a position to like look at any challenge that way, where it's like, well, if I could do that, why not this? And I think also just kind of like looking at a big picture too, where, when I was in college and meeting my cross country coach for the first time, like my mindset was, I don't think I'll ever run 100 miles in a week. Like that would be ridiculous. Even though he told me the juniors and seniors, it's not uncommon that they'll do a 100-mile training week in the summer. And I'm like, I'll never do that. And I think part of it is being just living in the moment enough not to let that stop you from trying, but also letting it be like having that kind of naivety also kind of keep you in check to a degree, so you don't go out and do something too ridiculous too soon. Because there's also a part of my personality who could have heard that and been like, oh, well, I'm going to start doing that now and get ahead of it, and then burn myself out by trying to run 100 miles in a week when I was not nearly ready for it yet. So I think like both looking at things in the big picture, the long term, and seeing where those successes are can be motivating. But then eventually you have to get around, I think, to just giving yourself small, achievable goals as well that are going to keep you motivated on the day to day when you wake up at, early in the morning for a workout and you just want to hit the snooze button and go back to bed. And, there's those days too, where I think having like some short-term goals are really important too. And those are things that I think people can stack up quite quickly if they want to, because it can be something as simple as, hey, I've got this list of 5 things I want to accomplish today. I'm going to check all of them off and then feel good about that. And the next day you're maybe a little more motivated to kind of stay on that course. And the more days like that you pile up, the more big goals you achieve, the more motivated you are to kind of reach a little higher. And then it ends up becoming like a long-term building project that offers up small rewards and big rewards along the way.
Yeah, I think that's huge because you're one of those people who've achieved greatness in your sport. Like you've been at the pinnacle and you've done great things and you've inspired a ton of people and you helped a lot of people along the way. And I think, what life lessons have you learned that, like, really, I started this podcast because I saw so much hopelessness and people had no faith, nothing to lean on. And I was like, why do we have, like, no one's giving hope right now? Everyone's scared and stressed. And like, what do you tell that person who's like at the end of the rope, go, look, I can't take that next step? I mean, you're a guy who's taking the next step when your body says you cannot take another step. But in real life, what kind of advice would you tell people? What life lessons have you learned along the way that you would want to pass on to people?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it's oftentimes pretty unique to the person's situation and kind of where they're at. But I mean, I put a lot of stock in both like not being afraid to dream big, because I think a lot of times people, they'll either like, I think everyone has a dream if they're willing to admit it, as to what they would want to be if like they had everything kind of line up the way that they had wanted to, if they could go back and right some wrongs and all that sort of stuff. And I what I like to tell folks is just like, it's great to have that stuff, but you need to build in those short-term goals and those progress markers along the way that are going to really drive you and keep you motivated. I think of this like, yeah, like I'm really fortunate, I think, in the sense that I kind of accidentally did this to a degree when I was unaware that this was the approach that was going to work well for me. Is just like, when I was in high school training for track and cross country, I just didn't really have a good understanding of what like a great 5K time really was, and how far away from that I actually was from like just like a professional standpoint. So I was able to kind of live in my own little world long enough to find little successes that at a grand scale were pretty meaningless to anyone but myself. But to me, they were very important at the time. They kept me doing it. So I think like being aware of where you want to be is totally fine, but being realistic about where you're at is the huge next step that I think sometimes people forget about and end up losing interest, losing motivation, because it's just too hard to kind of lean on a goal that's maybe 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, when you have to also worry about what you're going to do today and tomorrow. So I think like kind of having tandem goals or scaffolding towards that big goal is really important in kind of personal growth, I guess. So whether that is like, I want to, improve my relationship with my friends and family, or I want to like move up in my workspace, or I want to take on some fitness challenge or something like that. I think always thinking about, well, what can I do today to take a step forward that's ultimately going to move me towards my end goal, even though when I look at that end goal 3 years down the road, I'm never going to remember this one step. So that's kind of how 100 miling is too, where you can get yourself into a point where you're like, wow, I've got a long ways to go. I'm 50 miles into this race. I'm tired and I still have 50 more miles to go. But ultimately, the only way there is one step at a time. So sometimes you do have to just kind of center in on that kind of in the moment. What is a small goal I can reach for now and get some motivation, some success from? And, I think that is a huge a huge kind of piece to the puzzle where you almost have to be tunnel vision to a degree, but not so tunnel vision that you lose sight of like the end goal as well.
When you're racing, are you racing against yourself, or are you racing against your competitors, or both?
It's definitely both. I mean, some of the events I've done have been like just straight up record chasing type events where, you know, there's other folks out there doing different races, some of them the same distance, some of them are completely different. They might be trying to see how far they can get in, say, 24 hours, where I'm seeing how far I can get in 12 or sometimes 48. And like, I mean, it goes on and on. Or people going shorter, they're chasing like a 100K split or a 50K split or a 50-mile split or something like that. So those ones are definitely more like I'm racing myself. I'm chasing a ghost, so to speak, if I'm going after a record of sorts. But then there's other events too, where like I did this race in 2019, 2020, there's just weren't a lot of races. Otherwise I'd share some examples from there. Yeah, so like to the JFK 50 mile was very much, I mean, there was kind of tandem goal there. I'd done that race twice in the past early in my year and just had really bad days. So I had this kind of like monkey on my back, so to speak, where I really wanted to feel like I executed that course properly. So that was the kind of like me versus me battle. But then it was also a situation where I was going to be competitive to finish in probably the top 3 that day for sure if I had a good performance. So, you know, there's other folks there who are doing their race, using their race tactics that they think are going to put them in the best position. So I'm also kind of keeping an eye on that. What are they doing relative to what am I doing? What do I have to do on this section of the course to make sure I'm still in reach from, you know, this person, or staying far enough ahead of the person behind me so that they don't, you know, see me and feel like they have enough gas in the tank to catch up and pass me and that sort of stuff too. So I think it's definitely a dual motivator, I guess you could call it. And I think that's the way it should be. I think you want to have a healthy respect for what you're capable of and know where your strengths and weaknesses are, so you don't overexert in areas that isn't your strength and then leave yourself weak during the areas where you're strong. But also, like, if your goal that day is partly to try to win or get, you know, whatever place it is, or beat your friend or something like that, then you also have to some degree respond to the race tactics and things like that too.
When the race is over, is there a mutual respect, or is there competitiveness? Are there bad feelings sometimes? And how does that work with you guys? Because you have to be competitive and mentally strong. So has that ever been an issue, or is it mostly like, because, you know, the one thing about MMA I always liked, these boxers, they, you know, talk trash, they talk about their parents and say terrible stuff. Then after the thing, that there's a mutual respect and a love, and they give each other a hug. Is that how it is in your sport too, or is there's like certain guys you don't like to lose to?
Yeah, there's definitely the respect afterwards. I think it's a very unique aspect to the sport that's very similar to like the UFC type stuff, where, I mean, those guys, they just know, like, I mean, they know what it's like to get in a sparring ring for practice, and the pain and the literal physical suffering that you have to go through to end a match like that. So like, I think the respect for one another there is that there aren't a lot of people like them that can kind of put themselves through that. And there's just a built-in amount of respect for anyone else who can tolerate that sort of physical punishment. I think with ultra marathoning is kind of similar too, where there's not a ton of people who can say, oh yeah, I went out, ran 100 miles in a day. And, you know, whether it's someone does it in 24 hours or does it in 12 hours, the story's the same. They started out excited, they started out fresh, and you live almost like an entire life in that one time period, because you go through such a range of emotions, such a range of ups and downs throughout that you have a huge story to tell. And like, there's this mutual understanding that person kind of went through that same kind of trial that you did. I would say the difference between, like, say, mixed martial arts and ultra running is all the trash talk and stuff is probably more so under the radar, if that. There's not a whole lot of that in our sport. I think there's a lot of just kind of upfront respect, and there's definitely, like, people are aware, like, if there's like a race, like say the Western States 100, where it's going to be one of the more competitive 100-milers in the world, you know, there's definitely like a lot of like predictions and fanfare and sometimes commentary from the top runners about, like, this is what I want to do, or this is my goal, and my goal is going to beat your goal, kind of a thing. But it's pretty like tongue in cheek and lighthearted. I don't think any of it's really like too much of a psychological thing where you're trying to psych out your competitor by telling them that you're going to break the course record when, they think that's a long shot for them or something like that.
So Zach, man, I appreciate your time. I want to be respectful of your time. I would talk to you for about 10 hours because you're so intriguing to me, man, how you do it and all this stuff. So you're on your deathbed and you got to tell people what's important in life. What do you tell them?
Oh, it's a good question. I think finding something that you really enjoy to work hard for is big. I think for me, one of the reasons why I'm really excited to wake up in the morning is because I've been able to find multiple things where it doesn't feel like a chore to do it, even though on paper it might look like that. And I think people if people keep an open mind and find where that is, it doesn't have to be the same thing. Like I get motivated by running. Maybe you hate running and you want to do, strength work or something like that in the gym. There's just so many opportunities nowadays to both exercise physically, exercise mentally, cool opportunities that can make life more exciting and more enjoyable. So I think maybe in some cases as adults, we need to kind of rewind back to when we were in middle school and out at recess and deciding what game we wanted to play. Ask yourself that as an adult. You don't have to leave that in middle school. You can ask yourself, well, hey, I've got 2 hours today to do something that is fulfilling to me after I finish my work day. What is it that I want to do, or what areas can I explore and really find that I have a passion in, and embrace that, because there's probably a community of other people who do too. And you never know who you're going to meet and who you're going to end up creating long lasting friendships with when you kind of dive into that.
Man, that's awesome. That's awesome stuff. I tell people all the time, I'll ask my patients, like, where do you find your peace? What do you do for fun? And they look at me like, they don't know. They don't know. They don't have a passion. And so it's always amazing. And then someone finds a passion, you see them just invest time and love what they do. And I'm going to come clean with you, Zach. I'm going to come clean, man. I'm enjoying running these days.
Oh,
I have this dumb program from a couch to 5K, and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to do it. But it was yesterday, actually, because I had today off. I was happy because I'm doing every other day now. But I ran past this point that I would always walk and always get tired. And I was like, I should be tired right now, but I'm not. I'm still going. And I'm kind of enjoying this. And the stars were out and it was a beautiful morning. And I was like, man, this is how, Zach, I get for 3 seconds, I get how you feel, right? And I was thinking, and I think about you, man. A couple of things I just want to tell you. I've had times when I first started my low carb keto stuff, and I'm like thinking about skipping lunch, and I was like, Zach Bitter can run 100 miles on keto, low carb stuff, then I could probably skip lunch right today. So that's why I told my patients, I go, you're an accountant. You said you're a desk all day. Look what Zach's doing. Come on, man. I use you as an example all the time. But also just that mental toughness that you have, and that you're decent in your kind of, every time I hear you talk, you go, yeah, but there's other people who do this better than I do. I can't run a mile as fast as these guys can, but you figured out what your skill in life is and you've made the best of it. And I hear you say, okay, now I want to run across the United States. Now I want to do this. Like, you reach the peak and then you see the next peak and you want to conquer that, right? That is so awesome to me. And that you remain humble and cool. And I see you lifting up other people and lifting them up for what they do, even though it's different than what you do. And so those are all important things. And I tell you, I was thinking about the other day when I was running hard. I mean, for me, running hard, I was thinking, Zach could have ran 99 miles and he'd still kick my butt on the last mile. And I'm running 1 mile and he just ran 99. But you think it's like, man, that's his, like, that Chariots of Fire is like, I feel God's pleasure when I'm running, and I always think, to you, I was surprised because I was thinking you must go into some Zen state when you're running, some kind of like other world. And it sounds like to me when we talk is that you're calculating and thinking and looking at your splits and thinking, and you're not just running, right? That's what's pretty cool. I just run and the lady says stop and I like her, and then she says start running and I'm like, oh gosh. So yeah. But you're it's amazing what you do. It really is. I tease you, but it's unbelievable what you do, man.
Yeah. And I think, there's definitely points where, for me, I've been doing it long enough where I can kind of zone out and still hit a split right on the second. So that's certainly helpful. I think there's points where it's beneficial to kind of get into like a state of flow, so to speak, when you're out there and just churn out some miles without having to think too much about it. But yeah, I think the data side is also interesting. But yeah, no, those are all very kind things, and it's good to hear that that's how I'm coming across, because I really like to be able to share my experience with others and hope that they can kind of learn from it, or find out that for them a different approach is going to be better. So I always like to share, like every once in a while I'll have someone reach out to me that says, hey, I was like, I was 400 pounds and now I'm 190 pounds. And part of it was because I heard your story on Joe Rogan or on this. And then I got motivated to actually like take that first step. And that's what led me to this, and that led me to that. And I think about that and I'm just like, they have just as cool of a story as I do. It was just a different starting point, and it was a different motive, a different kind of goal. So like, I mean, I have no experience losing half my body weight or having to take that first step when I know losing half my body weight is something I need to do for my own health and well-being. So to me, like, that's the same thing as, someone else looking at what I've done in a race and saying, wow, I can't even do a single mile at the pace you ran 100. And, there's all sorts of, like, everyone, regardless of how good you are at something, can find those stories with someone else doing something completely foreign to you, and then get that motivation. Because I think it is cool to think of like the mindset behind someone taking that first step on what will be a multi-year journey. And then when you accomplish that goal, like, looking back on that, I think is one of the more like meaningful things in life, is being able to reflect on just like the journey you took.
Man, there's no more wisdom than that. Looking at the journey and the people who've helped you along the way, the people you've helped, and those are the things we reflect on. When everything goes bad, you could always reflect on those things, And so, Zach, hey, thanks for your time, man. Thanks for all you do. And how do people get in touch with you if they want to follow you, have you train them, have them, just to get your wisdom? How's the best way for people? Obviously, your podcast, and how else?
Yeah, I have a few different activities, I guess, outside of the training and racing side of things. The easiest spot to kind of connect everything I'm up to, whether it be coaching or social media, training, and all that stuff, is my website at zachbitter.com. It's Zach with a CH. And then I'm probably most active on Instagram, which is just at ZachBitter.
All right, man. Hey, thanks for joining me. Thanks for all you do. Much respect. And everyone, you've heard greatness here. This guy he's unbelievable, man. I'm very impressed. And so even though he has a crazy sport, I still love the guy. And, I do, much respect. So Zach, thanks for joining us again. Hey, everyone, be kind to yourself, be kind to each other, go out and do good stuff. Be like Zach, take that next step, keep going. Even when things get hard, trust your past experience with faith or whatever it may be that just drives you on, because you've been through hard times, and you'll get through these hard times. So just keep taking that step. Zach, you want to close this in anything, man?
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on, Brian. It's always fun to chat. And I do love the interviews every once in a while that look into just kind of other things that branch a little bit outside of the day-to-day, like splits and nutrition grams and ratios and things like that. It's fun to kind of just look at it from a different lens every once in a while. So it's cool that you're doing what you're doing over here.
Hey, man, thanks for joining me. Can't do it without you. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information, and hopefully this helps you. Have a great day, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.